"I'll wash your feet and you'll walk," the maid said. Everyone laughed until Billionaire's daughter. The phone call that shattered William Sterling's last shred of hope didn't come with a bang. It came with a polite, sterile apology from a man in Zurich who charged $5,000 a minute just to breathe. Standing in his penthouse office, looking down at the city of Seattle through bulletproof glass, William felt the cold receiver press against his ear like a gun. "Mr. Sterling, Doctor," Van der Hoven said, his voice as crisp as a starched lab coat. "We have reviewed the latest scans. The spinal atrophy is absolute. There is no signal traveling from the cortex to the lumbar nerves. To continue seeking a cure is illogical. It is time to focus on comfort management." Comfort management, that was the medical term for giving up. That was the polite way of saying his 3-year-old daughter, Lily, would spend the rest of her life as a statue in a wheelchair, watching other children run through parks she could only observe from behind a window. William ended the call without saying goodbye. He didn't have words left. He had billions of dollars. He had software that ran half the world's banking systems, but he couldn't buy the electrical impulse needed to move a toddler's big toe. He left the office early. The drive to the Sterling estate was a blur of grey highway and rain, reflecting the storm inside his chest. When he arrived at the gates, the mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling architectural masterpiece that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Since his wife Eleanor had died in childbirth, the house had become a silent clinic. Nurses in white shoes squeaked across the marble floors. The air always smelled of antiseptic and lilies, a sickeningly sweet combination that made William's stomach turn. He bypassed the front door, needing air, needing to breathe something that wasn't filtered and sanitized. He loosened his silk tie and walked toward the east garden. It was the only part of the estate that the gardeners hadn't turned into a geometric prison yet. The weeping willows there were old and overgrown, their branches sweeping the ground like curtains. He expected silence. He expected the usual heaviness. Instead, he heard a sound that stopped him dead in his tracks, humming. It was a low, rich vibration, a melody that didn't sound like a nursery rhyme or a pop song. It sounded ancient, deep, and resonant, like the earth itself was singing. William moved quietly, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the damp grass. He pushed aside a heavy curtain of willow leaves and froze. The scene before him was so unlike the rest of his life that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating. The late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a warm, golden bokeh light through the leaves, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. In the center of this natural cathedral, his daughter Lily sat in her old wheelchair, but she wasn't strapped in. Her feet were bare. Kneeling on the dirt in front of her was Ada. William knew Ada only as a line item on the household payroll, the young maid who cleaned the library. He had never really looked at her. She was perhaps 23, with skin the color of deep mahogany and a face that held a stillness he had never seen in his high society circles. She wore a vintage uniform, modest and worn, with a white apron that was currently stained with garden soil. Ada wasn't checking Lily's vitals. She wasn't adjusting a feeding tube. She was holding a rustic, dented metal watering can. Beneath Lily's feet sat a galvanized metal wash basin, the kind farmers used a century ago, filled with water and floating flower petals. William watched, his hand instinctively coming up to cover his mouth, choking back a gasp. Ada tilted the watering can. A stream of water, glittering in the sunlight, poured over Lily's small, pale feet. "Water remembers, child," Ada whispered. Her voice was like warm honey. "The water flows and the blood follows. You are not stone. You are a river." William waited for Lily to cry. Lily hated water. She hated cold things. She hated being touched by the nurses who poked her with needles. But Lily wasn't crying. Her head was tipped back, her eyes, usually dull and vacant, were wide and fixed on the falling water. She let out a sound William hadn't heard in 2 years. A giggle. It was a wet, bubbly, genuine laugh. As the water splashed into the basin, Ada took her own hands, rough and warm, and began to massage Lily's ankles. She wasn't using the clinical, detached technique of the physical therapists. She was rubbing with a rhythmic, loving intensity, humming that deep song again. "Feel the ground, Miss Lily," Ada crooned, pouring more water. "The earth wants to say hello to your toes." And then William saw it. A twitch. It was small, a microscopic movement of Lily's left big toe. Then the right one curled just for a second, reacting to the temperature of the water. William's knees nearly buckled. The Swiss doctor said there was zero signal. They said her legs were dead weight. But he was watching a maid in a dirty apron elicit a reaction that $3 million of medical equipment had failed to produce. Tears pricked his eyes, hot and sudden. He felt like an intruder on a sacred ceremony. "What?" William's voice cracked. He stepped out from the leaves. "What are you doing?" Ada stopped pouring, but she didn't jump. She didn't look terrified, as the other staff did when the master of the house appeared. She set the watering can down gently and looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and bottomless, filled with a terrifyingly calm intelligence. "I am washing her feet, sir," Ada said simply. With dirty water, outside," William stammered, his mind warring between the miracle he just saw and the hygiene protocols he had been brainwashed to follow. "The doctors say she needs a sterile environment. She is fragile." "She is not glass, Mr. Sterling," Ada said, rising to her feet. She wiped her hands on her apron. "She is a seed that has been kept in a box. Seeds do not grow in boxes. They need rain. They need dirt." "I saw her move," William whispered, the shock making him tremble. "I saw her toe move." "The body sleeps when it is only treated as a machine," Ada replied, her voice soft but firm. "I was just waking it up." Before William could ask another question, the spell was broken. "Mr. Sterling!" The shrill voice of Mrs. Thorne, the head housekeeper, shattered the peace of the garden. The older woman came running across the lawn, her face purple with exertion and outrage. She looked from the galvanized bucket to Lily's bare, wet feet, and then to Ada with a look of pure venom. "Oh, my God, get away from her!" Mrs. Thorne shrieked, rushing to grab the handles of Lily's wheelchair. "You irresponsible girl! I told you to dust the hallway, not drag the poor child out into this filth. Look at her! She's exposed to drafts, bacteria." Mrs. Thorne began frantically wiping Lily's feet with a sanitized wet wipe she pulled from her pocket, erasing the warmth Ada had created. Lily's face crumbled. The light left her eyes, and she began to wail, a high, thin sound of distress. "It's okay, Lily. Mrs. Thorne is here," the housekeeper cooed, glaring at Ada. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry. This girl is new. She comes from a different background. She doesn't understand hygiene standards. I will handle this immediately." William stood there, paralyzed. He looked at Ada. She didn't defend herself. She just looked at Lily with profound sadness, as if she was watching a flower being crushed. "Wait," William said, but his voice was weak. The logical part of his brain, the billionaire CEO part, was kicking in. Mrs. Thorne was right. This was unsanitary. It was risky. What if Lily got an infection? The doctors had warned him about immune system compromises. "I'll take her inside to the nurses immediately, Mrs." Thorne snapped, spinning the wheelchair around. "And you," she hissed at Ada, "go to the kitchen. We will discuss your employment status within the hour." Ada didn't argue. She picked up her watering can and the heavy basin. As she passed William, she stopped for a brief second. She didn't bow. She looked him right in the eye. "You can buy a hospital, sir," she whispered, so only he could hear. "But you cannot buy a miracle. That you have to invite in." So she walked away, head high, leaving William standing alone in the garden. The smell of the earth lingered, But the humming had stopped, replaced by the distant, terrified crying of his daughter being wheeled back into her sterile prison. The decline was immediate and terrifying. In the week following the incident in the garden, the Sterling mansion returned to its proper state. Mrs. Thorne, citing a breach of safety protocols, had effectively banished Ada. She hadn't fired her, William had surprisingly forbidden that, but she had reassigned the girl to the sub-basement laundry rooms. Ada was now a ghost, spending her days washing sheets and ironing shirts in the windowless depths of the house, strictly forbidden from ascending to the nursery floor. Upstairs, silence reigned again. But it was a heavy, suffocating silence. Lily stopped eating. The puree the nurses prepared sat untouched. Her colour, which had flushed pink in the garden, turned a translucent waxen grey. The physical therapists came for their daily sessions, manipulating her limbs, but her legs were stiff, cold, and unresponsive. The spark William had seen, the twitch of the toe, was gone. William stopped going to the office. He sat by Lily's bedside, watching the heart monitor beep. It was a rhythmic countdown to nothing. "It is a regression," Dr. Roberts, the local specialist, explained, adjusting his glasses. "Common in degenerative cases. Her body is tired, Mr. Sterling. The excitement in the garden likely stressed her system. It is best she rests." Rest. They kept saying rest, but to William it looked like dying. By the fifth night the house was asleep, but William was pacing the hallway like a caged animal. He couldn't get the sound of that humming out of his head. He couldn't forget the way Lily had looked at the water. She is not glass. She is a seed. Driven by an instinct he couldn't name, William went downstairs. He passed the grand foyer, past the kitchens, and opened the heavy door that led to the servants' quarters in the basement. The air changed as he descended. It became warmer, smelling of laundry soap and something else, dried herbs, sage. He found Ada's room at the end of the narrow corridor. The door was ajar. "Ada?" he called out softly. There was no answer. The room was empty. She was likely working the late shift in the ironing room. William stepped inside. It was a tiny room, stark and simple, but it felt alive. There were no expensive paintings, just a small vase with wild dandelions on the nightstand, and a book. It was a worn, leather-bound journal, cracked at the spine. William knew he shouldn't touch it. It was an invasion of privacy, but he was a desperate father. He picked it up. He opened it to a page dated 3 weeks ago, the day Ada was hired. "The house is made of gold, but the walls are crying." The handwriting was elegant, looping script. "I saw the little one today. Lily. She is not sick in the way they think. Her spirit is starving. They feed her medicine, but no one feeds her soul. Her father looks at her like a broken clock he cannot fix. He does not see that she is waiting for permission to be a child." William's breath hitched. He turned the page. "I sang to her today while dusting." She turned her head. The nurses didn't notice. "They only look at machines. I know what she needs. My grandmother taught me that paralysis of the legs often starts with paralysis of the heart. The blood stops flowing when there is no joy to pump it. I must wash her feet. I must connect her to the ground. If I don't, she will fade away before the winter comes." William sank onto the narrow bed, clutching the diary. He had thought Ada was just an uneducated girl playing with mud. But reading this, he realized she had diagnosed his daughter better than the entire medical board of Switzerland. She saw Lily. She truly saw her. He flipped to the last entry, written yesterday. "They have locked me in the dark. I cannot hear her, but I can feel her crying. She is cold. They have wrapped her in plastic and silence again. I pray for the father. He loves her, but his fear is a cage. He thinks money is a shield. He does not know that love is the only weapon strong enough to break bone and sickness. Love is the only weapon." William whispered the words aloud. Suddenly, A piercing sound cut through the floorboards above him. Beep, 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 beep. It was the code blue alarm from the nursery. William dropped the diary and bolted. He sprinted up the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took the steps 2 at a time, crashing through the door to the main hall and racing up the grand staircase. When he burst into Lily's room, it was chaos. 3 nurses were hovering over the bed. The monitors were flashing red. Lily was arching her back, her small body convulsing in a silent seizure. Her eyes rolled back in her head. "Her oxygen is dropping," one nurse shouted. "Prepare the anticonvulsant, 5 milligrams." "She's not responding to the stimulus." Mrs. Thorne was in the corner, wringing her hands. "Oh, the poor angel! Call the ambulance!" William stood in the doorway watching the scene. It was a replay of every nightmare he had ever had. Sterile, panic, needles, desperation. They were trying to force her body to submit, trying to chemical bomb the seizure into silence. He looked at Lily's feet. They were sticking out from under the heavy wool blanket. They looked blue, dead. She is not glass, she is a seed. A rage, hot and clarifying, exploded in William's chest. He didn't want comfort management. He didn't want a sedative. He wanted the water. "Stop!" William roared. The sound was so loud it shook the crystals on the chandelier. The nurses froze, syringes hovering in mid-air. "Mr. Sterling, she is seizing. We must—" "I said get away from her!" William shoved past the head nurse. He grabbed the railing of the bed. He looked at the terrified staff, at Mrs. Thorne, at the millions of dollars of equipment that was failing his daughter. "Mrs. Thorne," William said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, "get Ada, now." The laundry girl?" Mrs. Thorne sputtered. "Sir, this is a medical emergency. We need a doctor, not a maid." "If you are not back here with Ada in 30 seconds, William said, his eyes burning with a wild intensity, "you will not only be fired, I will ensure you never work in this hemisphere again. Go!" Mrs. Thorne turned pale and ran. William turned back to his daughter. He took her small, cold hand. It was limp. "Hold on, Lily," he whispered, pressing his forehead to her knuckles. "I'm sorry I listened to them. I'm listening now. I'm listening." The seconds ticked by like hours. The monitor kept screaming. And then the door opened. Ada stood there. She wasn't out of breath. She looked calm, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She didn't look at the nurses or the equipment. She looked straight at William. "Help me," William pleaded, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. "The machines aren't working. Help me wash her feet." The silence that followed Ada's entrance was not empty. It was heavy, charged with a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. The frantic beeping of the cardiac monitors seemed to recede into the background, drowned out by the sheer force of her presence. She didn't run to the bedside. She didn't look at the flashing red lights that signaled Lily's distress. She moved with the deliberate, ancient grace of a woman walking into a temple. "Get the basin," Ada said. It wasn't a request. It was a command given in a soft, low timbre that cut through the panic like a blade. The head nurse, a woman named Sister Margaret who had 30 years of ICU experience, bristled. "Mr. Sterling, this is insanity. The child is hypoxic. We need to intubate immediately or she could suffer permanent brain damage. You cannot let the cleaning staff interfere with a medical crisis." William looked at the nurse. He saw the gleam of the laryngoscope in her hand, cold steel meant to be shoved down his daughter's throat. Then he looked at Ada, who was already kneeling by the bed, her hands resting gently on Lily's shins, her eyes closed in a silent prayer. "Touch her with that metal," William said, his voice trembling with a dangerous kind of calm, "and I will destroy you. Step back." "Mr. Sterling, I said step back," William roared, stepping between the medical team and the bed. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who moved markets with a whisper, but he had never looked as formidable as he did in that moment, standing guard over his child with nothing but desperation and instinct. The nurses retreated to the wall, shock painted on their faces. Mrs. Thorne stood by the door, hand over her mouth, watching the disaster unfold. "The water, sir," Ada whispered, not looking up. "Bring the water. Warm. From the tap is fine. It does not need to be holy." "The love makes it holy." William moved. He ran into the ensuite bathroom, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the handle. He grabbed the plastic washbasin the nurses used for sponge baths. It wasn't the rustic, galvanized metal one from the garden, but it would have to do. He filled it with warm water, testing the temperature against his own wrist, a fatherly instinct he hadn't realized he possessed. When he returned, Ada stripped the heavy wool blankets off Lily's legs. The little girl's limbs were pale, almost blue, trembling with the aftershocks of the seizure. Her eyes were open but rolled back, seeing nothing. "Place it here," Ada guided him. William set the basin at the foot of the bed. Together, they lifted Lily's feet and lowered them into the water. The reaction was not immediate. The room held its breath. Ada began to hum. It was the same melody from the garden, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to resonate in the chest cavity of everyone in the room. She scooped the water with her bare hands and poured it over Lily's ankles, over her calves, over her knees. "Come back, little bird," Ada sang softly, her thumbs pressing into the reflex points of Lily's soles. "The branch is strong. The earth is waiting." William knelt beside her. He felt useless, just a man in an expensive suit kneeling on a Persian rug. "What do I do?" he choked out. "Hold her hands," Ada said, not stopping her rhythm. "Be the anchor. She is floating away. Pull her down with your heart." William grasped Lily's small, limp hands. They were cold. He closed his eyes and poured every ounce of his will, every regret, every memory of his late wife, every hope he had buried into that touch. "Come back to me, Lily. I'm here. I'm not at work. I'm not on the phone. I'm right here." The humming grew louder. It wasn't just a song anymore. It felt like a frequency. The water in the basin rippled. Suddenly, the frantic rhythm of the heart monitor changed. Beep, 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 beep. The racing tachycardia slowed. The jagged lines on the screen smoothed out into a steady rhythmic wave. The nurses at the wall gasped. "Her oxygen saturation is rising," one of them whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. "It was at 82. It's at 94. 98. But William wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at his daughter's face. The grey pallor was fading, replaced by a flush of pink that started at her neck and rose to her cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered. The whites of her eyes disappeared as her irises, bright, piercing blue, rolled down and focused. She looked at William. "Daddy." The word was a whisper, weak and raspy, but it was the clearest thing William had ever heard. "I'm here, baby, I'm here," William sobbed, pressing her hands to his lips. "My feet," Lily murmured, looking down. "Warm." "Yes," Ada smiled, her face shining with sweat, her eyes luminous. "Warm roots. Now, we stand." "She can't stand," Mrs. Thorne blurted out from the doorway, unable to help herself. "Mr. Sterling, be reasonable. The atrophy—" "Hush," Ada said. She didn't shout, but the authority in her voice silenced the room instantly. She looked at Lily. "Do you want to see the moon, Lily? It is watching you from the window, but you have to stand to see it." Lily looked at the window. Then she looked at Ada. There was a silent communication between them, a transfer of energy that defied medical science. "Okay," the toddler whispered. Ada took one wet foot out of the basin and placed it flat on the floor, then the other. She didn't lift Lily. She simply offered her hands, palms up. William moved to support her back, but Ada shook her head slightly. "Let her try." Lily gripped Ada's fingers. Her small knuckles turned white. She pushed. William stopped breathing. He watched the muscles in her legs, muscles the Swiss doctors said were dead, quiver. They tightened. They engaged. With a grunt of effort, Lily pulled. Her knees unbent, her hips straightened. She stood. For 3 agonizing, beautiful seconds, Lily Sterling stood on her own 2 feet, supported only by the balance of Ada's hands. She wasn't just standing, she was grounding. Then her knees buckled, and William caught her instantly, scooping her up into his arms, burying his face in her neck. But it didn't matter that she fell. She had stood. The circuit had been reconnected. The room was dead silent. The monitor was beeping a perfect, steady rhythm. William stood up, holding his daughter, who was now falling into a natural, peaceful sleep, against his shoulder. He turned to the room. His face was wet with tears, but his expression was harder than granite. "Get out," he said to the medical team. "Mr. Sterling, we need to observe." "I said get out." William stepped forward. "Take your machines. Take your needles. Take your negativity and leave my house. If I see a bill from your agency, I will burn it." The nurses scrambled to disconnect the equipment, wheeling the heavy carts out of the room in a chaotic retreat. Then William turned his gaze to Mrs. Thorne. The housekeeper was trembling, her face pale. "Mr. Sterling, I was only trying to protect—" "You tried to protect the protocol," William said, his voice dropping to a whisper so he wouldn't wake Lily. "You didn't protect the child. You threw a blanket in the trash because it was old. You banished the only person who actually healed her because she didn't fit your image of this house." He walked to the door and held it open. "Pack your things, Mrs. Thorne. The car will take you to the city in the morning. I don't want to see you when I wake up." Mrs. Thorne looked at Ada, who was quietly drying the floor with a towel, humble and invisible again. The housekeeper opened her mouth to speak, found no words, and fled into the hallway. William closed the door. He walked over to the bed and tucked Lily in. Then he turned to Ada. She was wringing out the towel into the basin. She looked exhausted. Her shoulders slumped. "Who are you?" William asked. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was a question filled with awe. Ada paused. She looked at the moon through the window. "I am just a woman who remembers what people forget, sir. My grandmother was a healer in the bayou. She taught me that medicine fixes the body, but love fixes the will to live. Your daughter, she didn't want to be here. The house was too cold. I just made it warm enough for her to stay." William walked over to her. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. It was rough, calloused from scrubbing his floors. He held it with both of his. "You will never scrub a floor in this house again," William promised. "You are not a maid. You are family." 6 months later, the Sterling estate had changed. The imposing iron gates were open. The front lawn, once a manicured expanse of forbidden green perfection, was now littered with evidence of life. A plastic tricycle lay on its side near the fountain. A chalk drawing of a very lopsided sun covered the slate walkway. In the east garden, the weeping willows were still there, but the silence was gone. A charity gala was in full swing. The elite of the city were there, senators, tech rivals, socialites, holding champagne flutes and murmuring among themselves. But the atmosphere wasn't stiff. There was a jazz band playing, and the smell of barbecue, a scandalous addition by the new lady of the house, wafted through the air. William stood on the terrace, watching the crowd. He looked different. The lines of exhaustion around his eyes were gone. He wasn't wearing a tie. "Nervous?" A soft voice came from beside him. William turned. Ada stood there. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a stunning, flowing dress of emerald green silk that complemented her dark skin perfectly. Her hair was braided in an intricate crown. She looked like a queen. "A little," William admitted, taking a sip of his water. "I'm about to give away half my fortune. The board thinks I've lost my mind." "You haven't lost your mind, William." Ada smiled, resting a hand on his arm. "You've just found your heart." "Daddy! Ada!" The shout came from the center of the lawn. The crowd parted. Running, not walking, running, toward them was Lily. She wore a bright yellow dress, and her legs, though still sporting light braces on her ankles for support, were strong and moving with a chaotic, joyous rhythm. She stumbled on the grass, and the entire crowd gasped, instinctually reaching out to catch her. But Lily didn't cry. She pushed herself up, laughed, and kept running. She slammed into William's legs, wrapping her arms around his knees. "I beat him! I beat the boy!" She pointed to a breathless little boy who was chasing her. William scooped her up, spinning her around. The sound of her laughter was the greatest symphony he had ever commissioned. He walked to the microphone stand at the center of the terrace, holding Lily in one arm and reaching for Ada with the other. The crowd fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," William said, his voice amplified across the garden. "You all know why we are here. To launch the Eleanor Sterling Foundation for Holistic Pediatric Care." He looked at the crowd, at the doctors who were now listening, really listening. "For years, I thought power was about control," William continued, looking at Ada. "I thought I could fix the world if I just wrote a big enough check. I was wrong. I was poor. I was the poorest man on earth until a woman with a watering can walked into my garden and showed me that the most expensive medicine in the world is worthless without the human touch." He pulled Ada closer. She blushed, but stood tall. "This foundation isn't about fancy machines," William announced. "It's about integration. It's about treating the soul alongside the cells. And it will be led by the woman who saved my life by saving my daughter's." The applause was polite at first, then thunderous. But William didn't hear it. He was looking down at Lily, who was playing with Ada's necklace. "We did it," he whispered to Ada. "We just started," Ada corrected him gently, kissing Lily's forehead. As the sun set over the estate, casting that same warm bokeh light through the trees, the image was complete. The billionaire, the healer, and the miracle child. They weren't just a patched-together group of survivors. They were a family, rooted in the earth, finally growing toward the light. The wheelchair sat in the corner of the patio, folded up, gathering dust. It was no longer a throne for a sick child, it was just a chair. And Lily didn't need a chair. She had wings,